So this is a conversation with Mariam Barghouti. She's a Palestinian writer and researcher currently based in Ramallah. We spoke about a number of things. Among them are COVID-19 in the context of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority's relationship with the Israeli government, building transnational solidarity, Syrian-Palestinian solidarity against authoritarianism and oppression, the generational shift within activism, as well as building transgenerational understanding, the Black Lives Matter movement, how both her and I struggle with survivor's guilt, and we even touched a bit upon the protests in both Hong Kong and Lebanon. Now, Mariam's an old friend of mine, so the conversation is rather informal, but no more so than previous episodes. Same disclaimer as the previous episode. I'm currently in the middle of a move, so the audio quality isn't as high as it would be otherwise, but it shouldn't be too much of a problem, hopefully. So thank you for your patience on that. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
My name is Mariam Barghouti. I'm a Palestinian writer and researcher based in Ramallah.
Let's start with the general situation that you're in. You're in Ramallah in the time of COVID-19, so there's quite a lot of implications to that. Can you paint us a sort of picture of how the situation is right now in Ramallah?
Well, currently with the pandemic infection rates rising, there is a looming fear amongst Palestinians. And that's because we know that our health sector, our economic sector, and our daily lives just cannot withstand the impact of COVID-19. And we've seen what it's done to major cities around the world, from New York to Spain to Italy. And they are comparatively a lot more equipped than Palestinians. But because of a decades-long occupation, and because we have Palestinian governing authorities that have continuously collaborated with Israel at the expense of Palestinians, we're walking into a pandemic completely stripped of any resources, capacity, ability to even have a chance at confronting it. And what's worse is that even though in places around the world they tell you stay at home and practice physical distancing, that's not, we're not safe in our homes in Palestine. That's a huge difference that people don't recognize, that staying in our homes and this is in the West Bank, it means being subject to night raids by the Israeli army. It means risking arrest and detainment. It means Israel demolishing our tents that are meant to be field clinics for COVID-19. And then you have the refugee camps that are basically one entire house with thousands of people living in it. So one infection rate, as we are seeing in places such as Jalazon, Qalandia, and Balata and Nablus, that one infection means a rapid increase in infection cases within the refugee camp, because everyone basically lives together, because that's the style of refugee camps. They're highly dense, they're very concentrated, because the only expansion is upwards. You can't expand horizontally because of zoning restrictions and land ownership and all of these dynamics that come in. So the situation is, it's dark. I think about all the dystopian novels I've ever read in my life, and I think that it's our standing reality, unfortunately, right now.
You mentioned cooperation of the negative kind. I just remember I don't know, what was it, like 2 months ago or something, there were some of these headlines of how there is positive cooperation on fighting COVID-19 and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Was that just like overblown? Because I just remember it being talked about for like 2-3 days and then
Right.
stopped.
Right. So there was initial talk about this supposed collaboration and coordination under humanitarian crisis between Israeli authorities and the Palestinian authorities. But that one, Israel and PA representatives constantly speak about collaboration or cooperating with one another. But it is always, always, always a one-way street where the Palestinian Authority, with all of its flaws and shortcomings towards the Palestinian people, but it has constantly delivered on its promises to Israel in terms of collaborating. It has even arrested and provided Israeli authorities with information on Palestinian activists. So when we said they're collaborating under COVID-19, we all knew what that meant, that it meant, if anything, the Palestinian Authority once more being optimistic about true collaboration under the crisis that we're living, but also that Israel will not actually provide Palestinians, because if it is claiming to confront this pandemic to preserve life, at the same time, it's going and demolishing tents. And if it wasn't demolishing tents at the time, it was still continuing its settler colonial expansion. So it's all, the problem with all of this is they're just headlines. On the ground, it's a very, very different reality than what is being narrated is happening.
And the headlines always use more or less the same. I'm using the headlines as kind of like just a generic term here, but they sort of use always an underlying logic of depoliticizing the situation, as if the occupation of the West Bank, just because we're focusing on the West Bank, as if it's like, you know, it's like khalas, it's in the background, it's invisible now, it's not something that is, it's just a law of nature at this point. So like we put that aside and then we talk about all of the details of quote unquote cooperation as if these two aren't obviously linked.
I mean, yes, but this is also the nature of normalizing, right? Which is why Palestinians are constantly saying, please don't normalize with Israel and follow the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Because when you normalize something, it becomes part of the status quo. So presently, more than 70 years later from the events of 1948, Israel is a normal state. But how was Israel created? It was created through mass displacement and dispossession of Palestinians, through massacres, strategic massacres by the Haganah and Irgun forces, which would later become what is now known as the Israeli military. And that history has been normalized, that Israel is treated as a normal state. So it's a similar thing that is going to happen or is happening now. Even when we speak about Palestinians, when they're quote unquote rioting, it's taken out of its political context. Instead, it's shown as if we're just, you know, throwing an activity in the streets where we want to put ourselves in the face of live ammunition and fire because that's who we are. We're angry people. And it comes with a sort of Eurocentric conceptualization of the Arab world in general. But also because we are fighting a colonial power. But even when you do read the headlines, Joey, we don't hear the word colonial. That we keep like reducing it and sugarcoating it. Now it's an occupation. Even military imposed occupation is rarely written in the context. So all of these things show you that they highlight how the world completely negates Palestinian existence, and it completely negates the context and the history and the present of the reality.
No, absolutely. I was thinking just while you were talking, like how we organize our conversation in a sort of timeline manner, but I think it's impossible if because then we always have to start in the 40s or even 30s, and you know, and that wouldn't necessarily be as productive. But I mean, I remember well, we've known each other for a while, and I remember one of the events, I suppose, that most attracted my attention at the time was back in 2014 during the bombing of Gaza. that there were these there was a coincidence. I forgot, I'm very bad with dates, but I remember it was more or less around the same time that you had the events in Ferguson in America.
Yes.
And there was these attempts by Palestinians and Palestinian Americans, I believe, to essentially send kind of like solidarity, but through the solidarity wasn't just we stand in solidarity with you, which also happened, but it was like with specific advice and tactics of like what to do with tear gas, what to do if you're cordoned by the cops, what to do and that kind of thing, how to be on the defensive position, how to be that kind of thing. Can you talk a bit about that if you remember it well?
Yeah, I can. And it's also a moment that is difficult to forget. It was at a time where I was younger and I was still getting into this transnational understanding of solidarity and moving beyond the localization of struggle to Palestine or the Arab world. And I also became aware to the value of action. So I recall when I was reading about what was happening in Ferguson, obviously through social media, as at the time it was still, during peak years as well for the quote unquote Arab Spring. So we were always on social media as it is and utilizing it to amplify our own voices. But I remember reading about Ferguson. At first I was excited that was happening because naturally sometimes we romanticize struggle, but to see confrontation is also something that is empowering nonetheless. But I didn't want to reduce my solidarity to a line saying I'm in solidarity with you. This is also the problem with international discourse on Palestine, where okay, we'll issue a letter of condemnation on Israeli practices, but there is no action. But within my capacity and within my resources, for instance, at the time, all I could really offer was just some advice on how to deal with the repression, especially after recognizing that a lot of the tear gas canisters that were being used there were similar to the tear gas canisters that we were facing here in Ramallah just a few days before the events in Ferguson. So I knew that I could offer that or extend that kind of experience to the rebellions that were happening there at the time. But it also reminded me that that's what solidarity, I think, is. It's not me dictating how they should protest, how they should confront, how they should challenge these systems of oppression, but it is extending tools and resources where we can equip one another better in order to challenge these forces that do want to, in the end, just bring us down, to pacify us, to ensure that we don't confront, and to ensure that not only we are suppressed, those of us struggling, but to extend and export that embedding of fear to anyone that will think about extending solidarity. We also see what Israel has done in terms of exporting its practices against Palestinians abroad, criminalizing BDS or lobbying for its criminalization, and banning people from entry here to Palestine as a sort of punishment for showing solidarity with Palestinians. So it's a confrontation and challenging these systems beyond the boundaries of their blatant violence, because I consider these also forms of soft violence that are exported to the global community.
Yeah, this is like the intersection between different struggles and the similarities and differences, because of course there's always both. There are certain things, there are certain commonalities between most struggles at least, but the differences actually are what makes them even more interesting, I think. And in recent, in the past year or so, of course, we also saw different waves of protest movements from like Hong Kong to Chile to Lebanon, Iraq. I'm sure I'm forgetting many other places. And this has created a different kind of solidarity, or maybe it's not different, maybe it's just more pronounced now than before. For example, the tactics that Hong Kongers use to get rid of tear gas or fight back against the police. We're seeing them now being used in Portland, and we've seen stuff. So in the context of Black Lives Matter, and we've seen it also being used in Chile at the time last year. And there's always this potential that I feel is usually not recognized, or maybe we don't think about it because we feel like it's pointless or something. But like I had written a statement myself and like 6 or 7 I think, yeah, we were mostly Lebanese and a couple of Syrian activists, just like saying we support, or I forgot what the statement is, but basically just standing in solidarity with prisoners in Hong Kong. And we had that statement translated into Cantonese by an activist, and it went viral. It got like 50,000, I don't know what, in just a few days. And I could see the IP of the source where people are reading from, and a lot of them were reading from Hong Kong. And this just this and many others, I've been having different connections with the Hong Kong world in some ways, are what really started changing the way I see things. I wrote this sentence. I just, while you were talking, I was looking for it just to read it out now. Like, the reason I'm quoting here, the reason I'm able to continue to focus on calling for the abolition of Lebanon's racist kafala system is because I am fueled by the Black Lives Matter and Hong Kong protests. The momentum for liberation is never lost. It simply picks up at different speeds in different places at different times. And this is something that I'm personally, like, it's part of the underlying motive of this podcast. It's part of just trying to put these different stories and finding the link between them, and then just kind of letting them be, because they develop on their own. You don't actually need to do much other sometimes to just literally put someone, like to talk with someone who is involved in Black Lives Matter, for example, or someone who's involved in Chile or Hong Kong or Iraq or whatnot. So that brings me to the recent webinar you participated in. If we can talk a bit about the motive for you participating in it, in the sense of, and just talk a bit about it as well. The one on it was, I think, on the title was like Black Lives Matter to Palestine and Syria or something like that. Let's get into that a bit.
So I was also thinking, Joey, as you were mentioning the statement and how it is so important to make struggles visible, because I think our oppressors rely on maintaining it invisible to the population itself that is oppressing and to the outside world. It's kind of, it is no wonder that, for instance, now Israeli practices have shifted from massacring Palestinians to trying to at least have a justification or a narrative for it, because it relies on making our struggle invisible. And it's likewise, I think, across the globe. So when we start sharing each other's stories together, it's a form of making visible and recognition, and saying, we see you, we do see you, you are seen. Because one of the most terrifying things is to feel so completely alone when you're struggling, which is also why, for instance, I recently participated in that webinar that you mentioned, because one, I think as a Palestinian, and as a Palestinian that is in solidarity with the Black rebellion in the US, I want to ensure, one, that I don't co-opt struggles, right? And that I participated in that regards to learn, rather than kind of say, hey, we're the same, or hey, we're different. No, to just learn and to speak about my struggle, and to create those spaces where we can just speak about our struggle without having to face someone telling us, well, you guys should be struggling like this, or you should be struggling like that, which is usually what people who aren't directly impacted by the oppression tend to do. So people tell us, well, you should try peaceful means for Palestinians, as though we haven't. But it's also the recognizing, and at least in that webinar, I felt more comfortable speaking about Syria, because it's from Blad al-Sham, and I feel my own affinity towards it, as I also consider it a part of my struggle, especially considering that the Golan Heights, Julan, is occupied by Israel still.
Mhm.
And it's that making visible Syria for me, and it is quite unfortunate, but as an Arab woman and as a Palestinian, I think it's easier for me to extend and vocally, verbally, and very explicitly engage in solidarity efforts with the Black rebellion in the US than it is for me to do the same with Syria.
Mhm.
And that has been a source of frustration for me over the past decade or so, because Syria comes mired with it is a struggle against authoritarianism, against tyranny, but it is associated with just a single image
Mhm.
of Bashar al-Assad, right? And for Palestinians, the history of relationships between Palestinian political factions and Syria has further blurred the lines of, well, no, we shouldn't support the uprisings in Syria because it's going to destabilize the region. Or Bashar al-Assad stands with Palestinians, and that this very disgusting narrative that kind of justifies the oppression of a population if another is benefiting from it. And that's a lesson I learned from Syria in terms of extending solidarity. So when I do extend solidarity now to any struggle in the world, I do it with the recognition that it's not always convenient, it's not always easy, that you may lose a lot of things. I have, for instance, with Syria, lost many comrades, many friends. People have tried, to attack my reputation and my Palestinianism, that I can't be Palestinian if I don't support Bashar al-Assad or the regime, or that I'm, because I don't support authoritarianism, I'm implicitly supporting Daesh, which it's as if you have to choose one or the other. That we confuse what our rejection of oppression is, and we're selective about it. And that's something I learned with Syria, where now when I extend solidarity to the Black rebellion in the US, I do it with the recognition that, hey, in my community, we're also racist. And there is a racial hierarchy going on, and I need to be brave enough to confront it here, not just in places like the US where it's so pronounced. The reason I share and engage with other struggles is because it also teaches me to be brave enough to confront my own self and my own community, in that we don't want to mimic the oppression that was inflicted in other places. And I do not want a liberation that will come at the expense of someone else.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the feeling of not wanting to feel alone as well. I think it's very basic.
Yeah.
One of the frustrations, I can speak to the Lebanese case most obviously. One of the things that I know was being felt on the ground was that we sort of instinctively understood, and maybe let's just say this is my interpretation, but I think that we instinctively understood that had we not had this massive diaspora, it would have been much easier to just forget what's going on, or to forget the protests, especially in the first couple of months when the momentum was very high.
Yeah.
And this is I remember actually I was being invited on a number of podcasts to talk about what's happening and stuff. And I would always prioritize sort of like a non-hierarchical or grassroots focused podcast, so like anarchists, some Marxists, some whatever. And I got the same question kind of actually like 3 or 4 times. And the question is like, what can we do? What can we do to stand in solidarity with the protests and stuff? And I was like, for the most part, you don't have much to do, because at the end of the day, we need to figure this out. Like, we need to actually find a way to make it sense to us as well. But you can use the opportunity to actually learn what's going on in Lebanon. And it should go both ways. I think that there's been quite a lot of missed opportunities in Lebanon, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because there's a lot of them. But whether I mean, the most the most we've seen in the past decade is of when Israel bombs Gaza, we might see some
No,
protests here and there.
right.
That's as much as it gets, really. When it comes to Syria, it's also a similar thing, and there's also the added component of the fact that Hezbollah is obviously in Lebanon.
Yes.
And this is the missed opportunity that for me has really most frustrated me in recent years. In 2015, when I started participating with student groups at SOAS where I was doing my studies, it was first with the Palestine Society, and then I linked it up with the Syria Society. And what I really liked actually about that university is that the two of them were working together a lot. And I just remember feeling this profound sense of, I don't know if it's shame necessarily, but it's just unease. I was just so uneasy
Mm.
at the fact that we didn't, me and Syrian friends, for example, that I met in London, we didn't even need to explain to one another why there was no solidarity in Lebanon, or at least it wasn't that,
Yeah.
because the expectations were so low that we weren't even expecting it, essentially. And that's a problem. You know,
It is.
I feel in recent well, since October especially, there's definitely much more of a move going on. We're seeing more Lebanese paying attention to the racist kafala system, for example. We're seeing more Lebanese participating in or at least being more aware and more vocal on such
Mm.
things as the fact that women still cannot pass on the nationality in Lebanon, the fact, you know, multiple dimensions of the multiple layers of oppression that exists in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't, so that people don't get me wrong, I'm not describing the entire situation just cynically or there's no hope or anything like that. It's just that I think it is important to recognize that there have been some failings, and the failings are, you know, you might even say are normal. Sure, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But they're there and they need to be tackled.
And then I think to add on to that, Joey, is we also, when we frame different struggles or protests in this just large umbrella, that we forget that mass protests happen because of a multi-layered reality. And our experiences, for instance, with and I'll use the Palestinian experience here. For Palestinians, our experience with the occupation is varied. I don't experience it the same way Palestinians in Gaza do, or Palestinians in the diaspora. But nonetheless, when we protest on a personal level, it could be for different um, incentives, for different, like we're driven due to different reasons.
Yeah.
And we forget this, that we forget that it's also multi-layered, and it is intricate, and it is a system that has various components to it. So like things like fighting the kafala system, or people asking why there isn't solidarity in regards to Lebanon, is because, hey, we have, you know, these different layers that make up a social fabric. Again, we shouldn't turn communities and struggles into this homogeneous concept or idea, because at the same time when we do that, we also, as people who are active in struggle, may become quote unquote cheerleaders and forget how tiring, forget how exhausting, forget how difficult and challenging it is to undergo a struggle. And that we and I think also when you're saying, you know, not to sound cynical or that there's no hope, I think that that's just something for every generation to really deal with, because we're such an imperfect world. I'm certain my parents' generation felt like it was hopeless at times. And you know, we have to remember that a lot of, for instance, the privileges that we do have now are because of the struggles that happened in the past, and that life is a series of struggle, and that protest isn't, you know, a single moment in history. That even when quote unquote there is peace, I don't ever think it's really peace. It just means there are other people experiencing the toll and the burdens of whatever system of oppression it is that we don't really see. And that comes back to this concept: make it visible, and recognize. Because I think that's something that's what will help avoid questions like, well, what can we do? I mean, the first thing is to think, to learn, to break down stereotypes and misconceptions, to harness understanding and extend understanding to others. And then basically it comes down to, hey, any struggle in the world, if you don't know where to begin, start with looking at where you're complicit and stop doing that.
Yeah, at the very least, yeah.
At the very least.
Yeah. When you were talking about the generational angle, that's actually also one of my recent obsessions, because
Yeah.
I am, it's 2020, so I am almost the same age as my dad was and my mom was when the war in Lebanon ended. So they
Oh,
turned
wow.
exactly 30. They were born in 1960. It ended in 1990, so they were exactly 30. I turned 30 next year.
Oh,
And
wow.
this realization, in a sense, it's almost like I started putting myself in their shoes, or at least I picture it. I sometimes talk to them about it. And it made me realize that most of my waking years, it's like it starts around the time I'm 14 or 15. Before then, it's just a blur. And that 15 is when the war started, as in the sense, when my parents were 15 years old is when the war started in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And that's the entirety of what I remember so far, if you see what I mean. So it's almost like, for me, if I try to put myself in their shoes, and as I said, I try to talk to them about it, it's very difficult. Of course, there's a lot of trauma there.
Yes.
I sometimes even feel overwhelmed, but it gave me this new, it's like 2-3 years now that I started thinking this way, but like a relatively newfound appreciation of what exactly they had to go through. Both of my parents were rescue workers. They were in the Red Cross. And my father was, I think I've mentioned this to you in the past, but he was in Sabra during the massacre.
Yeah.
And so suffices, and he's half Palestinian, so suffice it to say that he has seen a lot of shit. And by the time he turned my current age, more or less, is when he had to decide to start a new life, and so on and so forth. And so, like, long story short, without getting too much into the details, it gave me this pause, in a sense. So it allowed me to kind of take a step back and appreciate that the struggles that we're going through now are different and similar at the same time to the struggles that our parents went through.
Yeah.
There are certain things that are the same. Corruption is still there.
Right.
Sectarianism is, and in context of Lebanon, is obviously still there. A lot of these underlying issues are still there. If anything, especially now, the recent crisis, it can be actually worse than in some during some periods of the war on an economic level. But at the same time, luckily for us, we're not dealing with a 15-year-long civil war. That just gives me a sense, and if you want, that there's, as I meant, so I'm repeating myself a bit, but there are similarities and differences, and these similarities and differences, like, each of them on their own, let's say 10 differences, 10 similarities, whatever, they tell a story, and there's something that can link us up with our parents, for example, just to use this generation example, in a way that can also link us up with the next generation. So if, like, we're millennials, then, Generation Z or whatnot, whatever terms we want to use. And that is what I've been trying to look at, in the same way as we're trying to build, let's say, transnational solidarities, Hong Kong, Palestine, Iraq, Chile, whatever. We should also build actual transgenerational solidarities, in the sense that, or transnational bonds maybe is a better word, that we recognize that they went through something. Those after us are also going through something. We shouldn't discard them. We have a tendency of discarding those who are younger than us, and that their experiences are valid, and that is very important. And it goes back to what you said before about fighting against this instinct of, or fighting against this policy of how, which is an inherent component of suppression, of oppression, of rendering things invisible. This is how we acknowledge agency, and this is how we make things visible again. Sorry.
Yeah. I think the generational gap is something that also, at least for me, when I'm younger, I approach with so much resentment and cynicism that I'm recognizing as I'm getting older, also just how challenging it is to confront after confronting day in and day out for years and seeing things just go towards the worse rather than the better, that I've even cast blame on my parents' generation for making all these terrible decisions. And I think, I humble myself these days and I think, well, okay, what's my generation going to screw up for the next one?
Exactly.
Because I also look at my nephew and a lot of also, so for me, a lot of my cares are, the Palestinian struggle, the political dynamics and all of that, and these inequalities. But I'm also looking at my nephew and a lot of his concerns are even bigger. He tells me, Auntie, we have to look at, the environment, and this kid is 10, the environment and just to make sure that we're not killing it. And there's this very, very nuanced awareness towards climate change. And we also see with people like Greta, leading this movement as well, not on her own, of course, but she did kind of become a face to that because of the way media works, unfortunately. But we can't forget the fact that she's very, very young.
Yeah.
And she does showcase also a shift in the next generation's approach towards problems, towards inequalities, towards preserving the world and human life on it. And I think I used to feel very belittled by a lot of people from the older generation, especially when I used to go to protests. I used to get made fun of all the time, saying, بدكم تحرروها, you're going to liberate it. Yeah. And it would just made me feel so bad about myself and so full of self-doubt. And in the face of any obstacle or challenge, I looked at it as a affirmation to what was said to me by the older generation, that I am an idiot for wanting to pursue these avenues. And I tell myself, Mariam, don't do this. Don't do this with others. Don't do this with the younger generation. And recognize when it is time for you to step aside and allow this new generation of youth who is, fighting for its future as well, to have its moment. That my job my job right now is to do as much as I can, learn as many lessons that I can, and extend them to that generation. Because that's also something I'm incredibly resentful for, is because of all the trauma. My bad if it's similar to with you, Joy, but because of all the trauma, for instance, my parents experienced with their struggle. My dad used to participate in the past with like Palestinian resistance and all of that, like every other Palestinian family, but they never shared the stories. And it was only recently that I started finding out things like the stories of having someone die in their arms at a demonstration or event, for instance, in Lebanon. And that's not something you recover from. And that is not normal. And we forget, because it's so prevalent around us, we forget that on a personal level, it can be so difficult for the older generation to talk, that I think we need to learn these lessons so we're not like them for the next generation, where we have better coping mechanisms to allow us to extend lessons and to allow us to express. Because there are studies also on how trauma is passed down from generation to generation. But I feel now with the global connections around the world and being able to share more, we have more tools in our toolbox. And I think it's our job to use them and develop them for the next generation.
I remember very well the first protests I participated in Lebanon, in Beirut specifically, was with a campaign called Save Beirut Heritage, and it was just to preserve, or to try anyway, to prevent the destruction of so many of the old houses and that kind of thing that were being destroyed in the post-war era under so-called reconstruction. And that's a different story in itself for another time. But yeah, I remember I we were walking through one of the streets. I think it was like Jemaise or something, and an old lady. I must have been like 15 or something, and an old lady with her friends, so like middle age in their 60s or something, and she basically told me, I forgot the exact expression, but it was something along the lines of like "ما تضيع وقتك," like don't waste your time.
Yes.
Don't
Yes.
waste your time. It's something along the lines of like it's gonna come down anyway. Like the building is gonna come down anyway. And this is something that, of course, I had a lot of resentment towards. And I mean, I still think it was wrong for her to say this, obviously. But the resentment is more nuanced now. It's no longer a personal one. It's no longer, I don't hate that woman. I don't hate that person. I don't hate my parents. It's no longer a, this is your fault thing. And I'm saying this also trying to humble myself because, and I did mention this in a previous episode, that I had a pretty bad fight with my mother just like last November. And it was related to the protests in Lebanon. And I'm not gonna repeat the story, but essentially, I quite literally blamed her for, like, I yelled at her and I told her, this is you're the reason, like your generation is the reason why my generation is leaving. I literally told her that.
Yeah. Oh my God, it's so difficult.
But there is this difficulty, and that difficulty is so layered in so many things. For example, when we talk about Syria, for my mother, Syria equals the Syrian regime bombing our house, period.
Yeah.
Our house was bombed in 1990. And that's it. Khalas, it stops at that. The details don't matter. It doesn't matter that they revolted against that same regime. These things don't matter. The details don't matter because it metamorphoses and it transforms itself into something that then get fixed in time, and everything associated with it is negative, even worse maybe, because it then gets transformed and it's demonized in the media and politics. I'm talking about Syrian refugees in this case. And then it becomes very difficult to talk about. So now the agreement is we just don't talk about it. She knows I'm doing all of this. She knows everything, more or less. She knows what I'm doing. She knows my activism. She knows my work and so on. But I just got to the point where I was like, okay, I know you've gone through all of this. You don't have, if she was like in a position of influence, like she was a politician, then it would have been a different dimension to it. But she's not. She's just a civilian in Lebanon. And so I kind of like, I'm learning to sort of pick my battles. But so what I'm saying is that this should translate itself, if picking my battles, because there's a difference between picking my battles and just being cynical, like just not bothering anyone with this,
throwing your hands up in the air.
Like it doesn't matter kind of situation.
Right.
But I fight that instinct or that tendency by making sure that I'm not doing the same thing with the next generation. So I'm actually, just yesterday, it's quite funny we're talking about this. Just yesterday, I submitted an essay, which will be out at some point, in which I basically also argued that there is a transgenerational bond building. I called it brotherhood and sisterhood, that can actually be developed here, because the next generation, and this is not just a romanticized thing, there are good studies about this. A lot of, not everyone, it changes from place to place, obviously. No point homogenizing, but they are dealing with many more things, or at least more intensely, due to the overwhelming presence of the internet, than we were to a large extent anyway, at their age. And I think there's a lot of potential there that we need to look at.
I agree, but also not, as you're talking about, for instance, your parents' generation, I think it's also important to, as we try to make sense of the world around us, as we become more exposed, and I think a little more wise, I suppose, or more knowledgeable on dynamics, that we should also brave ourselves to speak with the older generation in a way where we aren't defensive also about our own pursuits for change, and we're not casting blame, but to really understand all these different dynamics, and to also understand their mistakes and their successes. Like in Palestine, we joke how we have an intifada every 15 years, which is almost every generation,
Yeah.
because we don't learn
Yeah.
from the one before. So we're just doing the same thing in a cycle. So I've become to recognize that the more equipped we are about the history and the details in the history, it's always the details in the history that will be more equipped for the present and the future. And I think that's also become so difficult because we've intellectualized everything to a point that it's all purely macro. And we forget, in the end of the day, you know, I don't live with the world when I don't have a phone around me, and when I don't have my email around me. It's just me and my partner, or me and my parents, or me and very close friends. That it is about the micro, and we protest collectively so we can have this right to live in our intimate spaces with dignity, with freedom, with equal opportunity. And these are things that just consistently keep getting missed. And I think it's because we try to generalize, because we try to make all struggles the same, and draw parallels and all of that, that it's okay for me to extend solidarity to the Black rebellion in the US without linking Palestine in any shape, way, or form. And I think this is a lesson I also learned with Syria, that part of our failure to extend solidarity with Syria is because we have to insert the Palestinian narrative into it, rather than simplifying. So what I'm saying is to also simplify, and go to the basics.
And on a closing-ish note, I wanted us to just this everything we just talked about, another level to it, I guess, or another dimension to it, is also survivor's guilt.
Yes.
And this is something that, I mean, I've always had it. I'm, you know, I'm Lebanese, so there's that background and that context and stuff, but I'm like middle class Lebanese from a certain context in a certain area. I'm a man, obviously, cis man. There are, since I've been so involved with both Palestinians and Syrians in to different extents at different times, there's obviously then the comparison where, you know, at least I'm not in Gaza, well, at least I'm not in Aleppo. Well, I'm not in Beirut right now. I'm talking to you from Geneva because I have the privilege of being able to do a PhD here. The guilt about foreign passports, the guilt about class status, about in my case gender status or whatnot. Those guilt, I've been looking at them more generously in some ways in recent months. Actually, I think it's a COVID imposed thing, to be honest, just being indoors for so long and having to think about this shit.
Yeah, but we all become introspective.
We all become philosophers.
You are.
But what I mean by kinder is just trying to, I've always been very difficult towards myself. I've always been extremely harsh towards myself, to the point that if you told me that this is what this person is doing to himself or herself, I would tell you, get that person to a doctor, to a psychologist, like she or he needs help. And this is something that I know is so I'll say it in a different way. The reason why I've been sort of kinder towards myself on that front is that even with friends of mine that are from Gaza or that are from Aleppo, and by from I mean that also grew up and so actually saw the worst days and the worst years. And I have a good friend, close friend of mine, who's from Yarmouk, so Palestinian Syrian, who's from Yarmouk. And grew up there, and his father is one of the forcibly disappeared, and so like horrible shit. The fact that he has a British passport now is also another thing that he feels guilty about. Even he has survivor's guilt because he managed to get a bit luckier through luck, essentially, and his parents had the good foresight of sending him at the specific time and whatnot, and it was pre-Brexit, so there was an easier way of getting the nationality and whatnot. So the details don't matter, but what really changed the way I've been looking at myself is that it's one thing to recognize one's privileges, and that's extremely important, and definitely not a lot of people do that anyway, so we need to always be mindful of that. But
Right.
it's another thing to just paralyze yourself and just completely think that if you stop recognizing where you are and the privileges that you have, that somehow this makes it better to someone who has fewer privileges. But the problem isn't just you. The problem are the structures that make this a reality. The structures that mean that he might get a British citizenship, but his father is disappeared. That's not his fault. That's not
No.
something that he chose. If he
No.
didn't have the British passport, his father would still be disappeared. This is the very
Crux.
like horrific facts essentially that it's an ongoing thing with him. I basically tell him, trying to tell him, like, you have this thing, try and use it. Like, you have this thing, it allows you to be in London right now. This means that you don't have to worry about being yourself forcibly disappeared if you were still in Yarmouk.
But more than this, I think, Joey, it shows how much we've normalized oppression and abnormalized the most basic access
Yeah.
to our rights, to living freely, to not having to worry. And I think it's also part of the way dominating oppressive systems work. Yani, in Palestine, I feel bad that, you know, at least I'm in the West Bank, I'm not in Gaza. And at the same time, I was working on a piece on military assaults in Gaza. And, you know, interviewees will tell me, well, you know, at least we weren't in this neighborhood, we were fine. But I would take a moment and say, is it really okay and fine that your house wasn't getting bombed, but you're living under constant bombings for, let's say, 52 days in 2014? We've normalized oppression. We've become this suffering Olympics as well, where we have resentment towards others, and we showcased it, Annie, in Palestine. It's like, oh, well, at least you're a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, so you have access to 1, 2, and 3, for instance, the airport, and you can travel more freely. And it fosters resentment amongst the community members itself. And I think this is you know, the basics of the divide and conquer.
Yeah, this is how it works.
Rule. Exactly.
It's when we reduce rights, basic human rights, and we treat them as privileges.
Exactly.
Like, you should just be grateful that you're not being bombed right now. And it's like, well, amazing, thank you. And you know, like we end up fighting over the remaining scraps.
Yeah.
And we fight amongst each other. Like, honestly, like, you know this, we've talked about this so many times, and I've mentioned this on the podcast, so this is like nothing new or anything. And I know you need to go because you have an interview later. I just want to sort of re-emphasize as my closing note, and then I'll just ask you to kind of reflect on your own on your side as well. How important it is to try and take steps back when possible. Sometimes it's not possible, and sometimes the steps back can be physical, in the sense that you're lucky enough to be in a different place right now. For example, you go to a friend's house, you go to a different country, maybe, whatever. And when it's not possible, then there might be some ways of actually just taking a mental step back. And this is something that I used to just kind of dismiss, and it's like, well, this is just a privileged thing. But then when I was reading, and I interviewed a number of people from Daraya in Syria who were going through this siege, and then there's an amazing story of some of them building this underground library and that kind of thing. They were reading books that I would consider ridiculous. Like, they were reading 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and Paulo Coelho, and, you know, that kind of thing. And I was like, well, actually, that makes sense. Like, it makes sense that you want and it makes sense that you will read books that tell you that you have control on your own world, even when you don't.
Exactly.
And this is something that, you take a mental step back. Like, these were people who were under siege and everything. There was no step back. It was literally impossible to leave the city. And they would only take the step back by kind of gathering in this underground spot, for example, or at someone's house. Usually it obviously at someone's house is how it would work. And read out a book that maybe in a different context they would have found cheesy and useless. But in this context, I have a lot of issues with Paulo Coelho, but in this context, in this context, it makes sense. You're reading The Alchemist. Well, yeah, that makes sense. The Alchemist is about a person who basically controls destiny into his own hands, and this is what you're lacking. And so these were one of my realizations, if you want, that, I mean, as cheesy as it's gonna sound, like there are very, very human aspects to how we react to things that don't have to quote unquote make sense, but I think should be understood for what they are in the context that they come from.
Yeah, I think that's also such a great closing point, is that we forget that we're so imperfect as individuals and as societies, and our protests are a testament to this imperfection. And to also just remember the value of not just taking a step back with ourselves, but helping one another. Because I know I would have never been able to reach many of the realizations and lessons that I did to help me nurture understanding and recognizing others and myself, had it not been for the people around me who already had that tool. And they just extended it to me, even in the like form of a book, like you were saying about the books. Someone once gave me a book and told me, hey, just read it. You know what? Do it for me. I think it might help in 1, 2, and 3. Or to just hold my hand and remind me that this isn't normal. I remember my mother, every time as a child, we used to cross the Allenby Bridge that separates Jordan from the West Bank, and it's operated by, of course, who else other than Israel. But because they used to basically, strip search us years ago, it's not the way it is now. It was a very, very difficult, horrible experience. My mom would hold my hand and she would say, you won't understand hella, or you won't understand now, but mom, this is not normal. And it was this statement, for instance, that reminded me, or has nurtured my conceptualization that this is not normal. So every time I go through a checkpoint and I just realize that I'm pulling out my ID just by mere predisposition to expecting that that's what's going to be asked, I tell myself, this is not normal. I mean, I take that moment. So it's also extending lessons and helping others take a step back. And I think that it comes with the reminder that we're human and we're flawed. And you know what? Our struggles aren't perfect either. Of course, we're going to mess up. And of course, we're going to do mistakes. But it's one thing to say you're messing up, you're messing up, you're messing up. And it's another thing to actually help provide more tools and empowerment to minimize any messing up that we do. Not by telling someone what to do, but by providing tools and resources to them. And I think that's one of the most important things I've learned throughout all the years, whether it's in other struggles or my own, is to take a breath, to breathe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's an excellent note to end on. Mariam, Habibte, thank you for your time.
Ya Habibi, ya Joey!